The wind came down from the hills like it had a score to settle. It hissed through the brittle grass, flayed the barn door with its crooked nails, and scattered the last of the cattle like paper on a preacher's pulpit. He stood on the porch of a house leaning westward, spine bowed, roof patched with old tin and prayer. One boot heel tapped a slow rhythm on the wood, less a habit, more a tether to stay upright against the nothing pressing in on all sides. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 days, maybe more. Words had dried up like the creek bed out back. His hat shadowed sunburned eyes, jaw dusted with stubble a few storms past shaving. He watched the horizon like a man expecting God or a gunman. Same thing out here. The ranch was dying. Fences slumped. The fields coughed up weeds instead of grass. A drought had strangled the land, but it wasn't the only thief. Years of bad deals and silent winters had done their work. So had grief, the kind that nestles behind the ribs and grows roots like mesquite. He wasn't bitter, not exactly. Just hollowed out, carved by wind and loss. He'd buried his old man in that back pasture and left the grave marked with a rusted horseshoe. Nothing more. That morning, he saddled his mare with quiet hands. The rifle he strapped to his saddle was more rust than metal, but he wasn't riding to shoot, just to sell. The general store took odd items, and he figured the iron might fetch enough for flour and a sack of nails. Maybe whiskey, if the world was kind for once. By noon, he reached town, if you could call it that. A few buildings leaning into each other like drunkards, a saloon with a cracked mirror, a church with peeling paint, and a door that didn't close right. Dust clung to his boots as he dismounted. Men glanced his way and looked off again, like he was bad luck to look straight in the eye. Then he heard it. The voice of a man, loud and mocking, cutting through the heat like a whip crack. $10. That's what she's worth. The crowd circled in the square. Faces pinched, some entertained, some ashamed. He stepped closer, drawn not by curiosity, but something slower, heavier, like a storm building behind his ribs. The sheriff stood off to the side, thumbs in his belt, chewing something that wasn't food. He didn't interfere, just watched. On the wooden platform stood a woman. Young, not much more than a girl, but her eyes weren't soft. They were coals that hadn't gone out. Her dress was once white, now stained with road and sweat and something else. And she was pregnant, visibly, hands folded over the curve of her belly like she was holding the whole world together. The man beside her, broad, red-faced, his coat too fine for the dust, grinned and shouted again. She shamed the family name. And now we sell what's left. Legal and proper. No one stopped him. The rancher's jaw worked like he was chewing on rust. His hand twitched near his belt, but didn't rise. His eyes met hers for just a second. She didn't look away. He saw defiance in her, but also something that cut deeper. Resignation. Not surrender. Just a tired knowing that no one was coming to help. That the world had weighed her and found her inconvenient. Disposable. He stepped forward without thinking. The crowd parted like wind through tall grass. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, creased, dirt-smudged, bearing the seal of a deed long unpaid. The in-laws laughed when he held it out. "You want her," the fat man sneered. "That land ain't worth the ink it's printed on." He didn't reply, just stared, quiet as dusk. "Fine," the man said, grabbing the paper. "Your funeral. And hers." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Still need a witness, if you mean to wed." "I mean to," the rancher said, voice like dry gravel. "Right now." No one clapped. No one smiled. The sheriff muttered a few words over an old Bible he pulled from his coat pocket. She didn't speak, just nodded once when asked. When the sheriff asked his name, he gave it. When he asked hers, she didn't answer. He said, "Don't matter. She's mine now. I'll give her a name she can keep." There was a long silence. Then the sheriff scratched something down in his ledger and closed the book. "You got a wife, then. Guess that means you'll need a witness for when hell breaks loose." The rancher didn't laugh. He just turned to the woman. She stood steady, belly round, eyes sharp. He offered his hand. She didn't take it. Just stepped down off the platform beside him, like that was enough. The sun was sinking behind the church steeple, casting long gold lines across the dust. A crow screamed overhead. He led her to the mare, helped her mount. Then he climbed up behind, wrapped one arm lightly around her for balance, careful not to press. They rode out without another word. The town watched them go like ghosts had passed through. As the prairie swallowed them back up, a boy from the crowd whispered to no one in particular, "Ain't no way that ends quiet." Maybe not. But the wind had shifted. The land was holding its breath. And somewhere behind the silence, thunder was beginning to build. The road back to the ranch was long and mostly silent, save for the rasp of hooves over dry gravel and the occasional creak of old leather. Wind slipped through the mesquite like a whisper, too tired to shout. He rode with one arm loosely around her waist, not possessive, just steady. She didn't lean into him, but she didn't flinch either. The sky ahead boiled in dark gray streaks, swollen with the promise of a storm that had taken its time. Her dress, still dust-stained from the platform, shifted with the ride, clinging to the swell of her belly. He noticed she kept one hand pressed there, protective, like instinct. He wondered if the baby kicked. He wondered what name it would be given, if it lived long enough to earn one. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had slipped into the bones of the land. Everything looked washed in blue and shadow. The house crouched low against the horizon, its chimney smoking faintly from the ember fire he'd left smoldering that morning. He dismounted and tied the mare without a word. She didn't wait for help getting down, just slid off with a grunt, steadied herself on the fence, then straightened. Her eyes scanned the place, not judging, measuring. He pushed open the cabin door. It groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Inside was plain, a table, 2 chairs, a cold stove, a rifle above the hearth with more memory than bullets. 2 beds, one larger than the other, on opposite sides of the room, each draped with worn wool blankets. No curtains, no clock. Time passed here only by the sun and the creak of wood under bare feet. She stepped inside, looked around, and said nothing. He took off his hat, dusted it absently against his thigh, then set it on the peg near the door. She moved to the smaller bed, ran a hand over the quilt. He caught a flicker in her eyes then, something like recognition, or maybe memory. She sat, slowly, one hand behind her back for balance. He noticed how carefully she lowered herself, the way pain shadowed her jaw but never reached her voice. "I won't be trouble," she said finally. "You already ain't." She looked at him, then really looked. Saw the lean face, the weather-bitten skin, the tired blue eyes. His voice was dry, but not unkind. There was a pause, long enough to feel like the land itself was holding its breath. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "Neither did I," he replied, and then turned toward the stove. He lit the fire with a practiced hand, set on boiling water for coffee. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was thick with unsaid things, like a river swollen just under its banks. She watched him work, eyes tracking his movements, the way his shoulders never quite relaxed, even alone. He moved like a man used to being watched. The smell of fire and beans filled the space. She closed her eyes, just for a second. Maybe she saw something there. Home, maybe. Or maybe nothing at all. After supper, which passed with few words and no prayer, he offered her the bed by the window. She shook her head. "You keep it. I'm fine where I am." Her voice was plain, clipped. Not pride, not politeness. Just survival. He didn't argue. Took the chair by the fire and sat with a quiet groan, knees creaking. He watched the flames through heavy lids, arms crossed, rifle resting within reach. Rain began to tap against the roof, slow and uneven, like a hesitant knock. The wind had finally come to collect what it was owed. He heard her breathing shift, shallow, restless. A whimper followed, muffled by the quilt. Then her voice, sharp and strangled, broke the dark. "No, don't, please don't." He stood, boots soft on the worn wood, and crossed the room. She thrashed under the blanket, sweat on her brow despite the chill. He crouched beside the bed and touched her shoulder, light as wind. "Hey," he said, voice low. "You're here now. Ain't nobody gonna hurt you." Her eyes flew open, wide and glassy. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she saw him, just a man in a worn coat, kneeling, eyes steady. She didn't cry. She only nodded, then rolled to her side, turning her face toward the wall. He stood and went back to the chair, but sleep didn't come for either of them. Morning came gray and wet. The porch sagged under the weight of rain, and the sky showed no sign of clearing. He set a pot of coffee on and handed her a steaming tin cup. She accepted it with quiet gratitude. Not thanks, just the nod of one survivor to another. Later, she walked the length of the small home, touched nothing, but took it all in, the knife marks on the table, the broken horseshoe nailed to the doorframe, the bullet hole in the shuttered window. She paused near the fireplace, eyes catching the framed picture turned face down on the mantel. "Yours?" she asked. He looked up from patching a bridle strap. "Used to be." She didn't ask more. He didn't offer. But later, he found the photo had been set upright again. He didn't touch it. That evening, she sat on the porch with a piece of cornbread in her hand, watching the sky pull its clouds apart. He joined her, both of them quiet, both watching. Somewhere out on the edge of a land, coyotes called, thin and far. "They said the baby was a stain," she murmured. "Said it'd shame their blood. That's why they put me up there." He didn't flinch, just watched the sky and answered, "Sounds like their blood was already rotten." She didn't smile, but she looked at him again. Longer this time. He said, "You got a name you want me to call you by?" She shook her head, slowly. "Not yet." He nodded. "All right." The silence settled again, but softer now, less like a wall, more like a quilt stretched between them. Behind them, the house stood still. The fire had burned low. The beds were made. The rifle remained above the hearth. But something unseen shifted in that cabin. A thread drawn taut between two strangers. Strangers no longer entirely alone. The world hadn't softened, not even a little. But something else had started to take root in the cracks. Maybe not hope, not yet. But the shape of it. And out beyond the fence line, behind the hills, thunder murmured again. Distant, waiting. Spring came slow, dragging its heels like an old outlaw. The rain stayed just long enough to soak the roots, and the earth, cracked and cautious, began to soften. On the ranch, things didn't bloom, not outright, but they shifted. The woman planted a row of herbs beneath the window, basil, maybe, or sage. She didn't say, and he didn't ask. He built her a bench from spare boards and set it beside the garden without ceremony. When she noticed, she ran a hand across the rough wood, then sat down and said nothing. The days passed in quiet rhythm. He mended fences. She patched his shirts. He broke a new foal, patient and silent. She learned to feed it without flinching. Sometimes he caught her talking to the unborn child, low and soft, like she was trying to convince it the world might be worth arriving for. He listened from the porch, but never let on. Some things weren't meant for a man to interrupt. He still hadn't asked her name, and she hadn't offered one. But he'd started to think of her as something steady, weathered but still standing, like the cottonwood behind the barn that split during lightning but never fell. Then came the day the boy rode up from town, skinny and wide-eyed, dust caked up to his knees. He didn't dismount, just shouted from the fence line. "They're saying the girl don't belong to you, that she's got blood that ain't right. Some judge is comin'. Got men with him, too." The rancher stepped out of the barn, hammer in hand. "You see them yourself?" "No, sir. Just heard it. They say her kin's making noise, saying you took her illegal. Say she ain't fit to keep a baby." The woman had come out behind him by then, arms crossed over her belly, face like stone. The boy looked at her once, flinched, then turned his horse and galloped off, trailing fear like a ragged flag. Inside, the rancher poured water into the tin basin, washed his hands slow. The silence between them was thick again, not with distrust, but with too much truth waiting to be spoken. "They mean to take the child," she said. "They'll try." She nodded once, jaw clenched. "Then we'll need more bullets." He looked at her then, really looked. Sweat on her brow, a tremor in her right hand. The weight of the child inside her growing by the hour. She was strong, yes. But strength wasn't always enough. "They'll say they're the law," he muttered. "Law ain't justice," she said. You know that better than I do. That night, neither of them slept. He oiled the rifle in silence while she paced the floor barefoot. At some point, she paused near the hearth and noticed the edge of a loose floorboard. She knelt, pried it up, and found an old envelope tucked inside. Yellowed, edges curled. She turned it over, brow furrowed, then handed it to him. The handwriting was familiar, his brother's wife. A letter written in ink smudged by tears or rain. He read it aloud in pieces, voice cracking where it never had before. She'd hidden a child, it said. A girl. Half Comanche, born in fear, raised in silence. The name wasn't written, but the words clung to him like dust to sweat. He looked up at the woman standing across from him. She didn't speak, but something shifted in her eyes. Understanding. Recognition. My mother said my father died before I was born, she whispered. Said his people didn't want me. He stepped back, breath catching. Not from disbelief, but the weight of connection settling over them both like fresh snow. That land out there, he said, pointing through the cabin wall, was supposed to be hers. My brother's girl. She nodded. Then it's mine now. They didn't talk much after that. There wasn't need. They worked side by side, securing the doors, stacking firewood, checking the traps. She cleaned the pistols. He buried the deed to the land beneath the porch, not to hide it, but to protect it. Roots needed soil. So did truth. The next morning, the town turned colder. A letter was delivered by a rider with a silver badge. It said a judge would arrive in 3 days. Said the woman would be taken into custody. Said the child, unborn or not, would be removed for protective care. She read it once, then burned it in the stove. They spent the day preparing, not for a siege, not exactly, but for something more dangerous. Men with pens and guns, who believed power lived in ink and holsters. That evening, she stood near the grave in the back pasture. The one with a rusted horseshoe. He joined her without a word. My father's bones might be under different stars, she said, but his blood's in this dirt. He nodded. And yours too now. The wind was warm that night, carrying the scent of rain and mesquite. The sky pulsed with distant lightning, far enough not to fear, close enough not to forget. Inside, the fire burned low. She sat beside it, rubbing her belly with both hands, like shaping clay. You scared? He asked from a chair, rifle across his knees. I've been scared so long it's part of my breathing, she said. But no, not anymore. She looked over at him. Her eyes had changed, not softer, just steadier. Like someone who'd survived drowning and knew how to swim now. He considered her for a long moment. Then stood, walked over, and knelt by her side. I'll fight, he said. Not for the land. Not even for me. For you. For that child. She placed her hand on his shoulder. Then we'll fight together. In the silence that followed, a branch cracked outside. Not thunder. Not wind. Just a reminder that the world didn't sleep, even when it seemed quiet. He stood, walked to the window, and peered out into the dark. They'll be here soon. She didn't flinch. We'll be ready. The posse came just before dawn, when the land was still holding its breath between night and morning. The light was gray, thin, and wet, like the sky hadn't made up its mind whether to rise or weep. Hoofbeats rolled in slow, steady rhythm, 20 or more, led by a tall man in a black duster and a judge's white collar that glowed like a knife in low light. Behind him rode men with rifles and faces tight with purpose, the kind of purpose that fed on the weak and slept easy after. The rancher stood at the edge of the porch, rain sliding off his hat brim in long threads. The woman was inside, a pistol holstered at her hip, the cradle already beside the hearth. Her breath came heavy, not from fear, but from the weight growing inside her. Pain had begun to pulse low and steady, not strong enough to break her, but near enough to warn. She said nothing, just wrapped her hands around her belly and waited. The judge dismounted with care, like a man stepping onto consecrated ground. His boots sank into the mud. He approached with the confidence of paper law and bought authority. You've had your time, he said flatly. The girl is coming with us. She's not a girl, the rancher said. She's my wife. She's a runaway, a known defiant. And that child is a stain, born of mixed blood, unfit for proper care. We've orders from a county. Signed and sealed. The rancher tilted his head, slow and calm. I've got fire and steel. Signed by the dirt under our feet. The judge's lip curled. You'll make this worse. I ain't the one made it bad. Behind him, the woman gripped the doorframe, sweat dotting her brow. A contraction gripped her ribs like a vice. She bit down, hard, and breathed through her teeth. She would not scream. Not yet. Not while they watched. A shot cracked from one of the riders, meant as a warning, maybe, or a message. It snapped the branch of a cottonwood clean through. The rancher moved fast for a man of his age. The repeater in his hands roared once, and a man in the back fell from his saddle with a thud that echoed louder than the shot. Chaos surged. The riders fanned out, some firing wildly, others diving for cover. The judge dropped behind a rock, shouting orders with a voice high on panic. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood, peppering the walls of the cabin. The woman stayed low behind the stone hearth, hands pressed to her belly. Blood was beginning to trail down her leg, just a line, thin and sharp. The baby was coming, whether the world was ready or not. Outside, the rancher moved like wind through dry grass, silent, exact, relentless. He dropped one rider with a gut shot, another with a crack to the shoulder. He didn't aim to kill them all, just to hold the line. Then, in the middle of reloading, a rider burst from the side, axe raised. The rancher turned too late. Steel sliced into his side, a grunt torn from his lungs as he stumbled back, vision blurring. The man raised the axe again. The gunshot came from the porch. The woman stood barefoot in the mud, pistol shaking in her grip. The rider fell forward, dead before he hit the ground. She dropped the pistol, doubled over, and screamed, this time not from fear, but from the child twisting its way into the world. The rancher crawled to her, blood seeping through his shirt, hand reaching. She took it, teeth clenched, body rocking with pain. Together, they made it into the house. Door slammed shut behind them as more shots rattled across the hills. She collapsed beside the cradle. He wrapped her in blankets, pale and shaking, but steady. The air inside the cabin was thick with smoke, sweat, and iron. I can't do this alone, she gasped. You're not alone, he said, pressing his forehead to hers. Then the screams came, long, ragged, primal. Outside, the judge shouted for retreat. Too many dead. Too much resistance. The riders, shaken and bleeding, turned and fled back into the haze of morning, leaving behind their dead and their law. The land went quiet, save for the ragged breath of two people clinging to each other and the whimpering cry of a newborn, wet, loud, defiant. The rancher held the child with trembling arms, eyes wide, stunned not by the blood or the pain, but by the miracle of sound and breath. The woman smiled through her tears, bone deep and broken open. She's alive, she whispered. He nodded, voice a rasp. So are we. They buried the dead that evening. Every one of them, even the wicked. The judge among them, face slack in death, law undone by its own blind cruelty. The wind blew soft, respectful. Rain followed, warm and quiet, soaking into the earth like a blessing. Later, the rancher carved a name into the porch post, just one word. Not hers, not his. The child's. A name born of fire, storm, and blood. Inside the house, the cradle rocked. The woman slept beside it, hand draped over the side. The rifle was still above the hearth, but it was no longer the center of the room. Now the baby was. He sat on the porch again, bathed in starlight. Pain throbbed at his ribs, but it felt different now. Not punishment. Proof. Out in the fields, the earth had begun to sprout. They had written their own law with grit and sacrifice, carved their names into the stubborn bones of the frontier. What came next was unwritten. But for once, the future felt like something they might get to shape. And somewhere beyond the hills, the coyotes howled, not mourning, not warning, just bearing witness.